welcome to the World Deciphered. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. The world is preparing for a new president of the United States to take office in January during what is perhaps the most complicated time in global history. This week, we're sharing insights on how the CIA views the complicated global landscape with CIA Director Bill Burns. We're also talking with former acting director of the CIA, John McLaughlin, about what part of the world he sees as the keystone to today's global challenges. And then later, we're visiting another region where the challenges of Russian influence are on clear display. The Cipher Brief's chief international correspondent, Iya Mermishvili, is talking with Daniel Freed, who served as U.S. ambassador to Poland, about recent election results in Moldova, Georgia, and Bulgaria, and about why the challenges associated with Russian influence that have taken hold there represent a threat that reaches far beyond their borders. We're getting to all of that shortly, but first I want to check in with the Cipher Brief's managing editor, Tom Nagorski, with a look at the other stories making headlines this week. Tom?
Suzanne, the headlines from the Middle East this week, depending where and when you read them, sounded like the difference between war and peace. For the first time in months, a major diplomatic effort is underway to bring a ceasefire to the region, maybe two ceasefires. There are talks focused on Lebanon, where Israel has been pounding Hezbollah targets and where the civilian toll is soaring, and ceasefire negotiations involving Gaza as well. Top officials from the region are back at the negotiating table. CIA Director Bill Burns is back in the mix as well. All sounds like an important step towards peace. However, on Thursday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made clear that he is in this war for the long haul, aiming for what he called total victory over Hamas and Hezbollah, no time frame for how long that might take. And notably, he also said, quote, Israel has greater freedom of action in Iran today than ever before, and that certainly sounded like Israel isn't done with its attacks on Iran. And Suzanne, this week we learned that those North Korean troops, 8,000 of them, according to multiple intelligence assessments, are now in the Kursk region of Russia, meaning still in Russian territory, but certainly involved in the Ukraine war, as that's the area that Ukrainian forces captured a couple of months ago. It's a stunning moment in the war, troops from North Korea being used by Russia to repel a Ukrainian incursion. And that news came on the day that North Korea fired an intercontinental ballistic missile, first time they've done that in nearly a year. Experts said it flew higher and for longer than previous missile launches. And finally, speaking of missiles, the U.S. says it's running low on supplies of some air defense missiles that have been used against those Iranian strikes and against Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. The Wall Street Journal reports that these interceptor missiles are in especially high demand and that the Pentagon is concerned it's burning through them faster than the missiles can be replaced. The big worry there being the stockpile that will be needed in the event of a future conflict with China. A lot going on. Suzanne, back to you.
Thanks, Tom. And you can find more on all of the stories that Tom mentioned at thecipherbrief.com. Following up now on elections around the world. The 47th President of the United States takes office in January and will be occupying the Oval Office during what is most likely the most complicated time in global history. With war in Ukraine and the Middle East, saber-rattling over Taiwan, and tensions high in the South China Sea, there is much to focus on. First up, former CIA acting director John McLaughlin tells the Cipher Brief that there is one part of the world where we're seeing all of these challenges come together.
The first thing I would say is that Ukraine is, in my mind, the keystone of all of these problems we're dealing with in the world, because if we didn't have the war in Ukraine, there'd be very little motive for Putin to be involved this deeply with North Korea. Iran would not be as deeply involved inside Russia as it is. North Korea would not be sending troops into Europe if it weren't for Ukraine. So this so-called, this new axis of authoritarianisms would not be as tight or perhaps not even exist in the form it does without the Ukraine war.
And you can watch the Cipher Brief's full interview with John McLaughlin on the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel. I also recently sat down with CIA Director Bill Burns to get his sense of how the agency is viewing today's complicated landscape, particularly in light of the alliance between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Here's a bit of what he told us, starting with Ukraine.
There's enormous challenges ahead, as the Ukrainians understand better than anyone. I would not underestimate Putin's singular fixation on controlling Ukraine and controlling its choices, but nor would I underestimate the courage and tenacity of Ukrainians, so long as we continue to provide strong support, not just at CIA, but across the US government and across our allies as well. Putin, in my experience dealing with him over many years, always thinks Americans have attention deficit disorder, and sometimes we demonstrate that. We move on to the next challenge. This is one of those cases where we have to demonstrate the strength of our support for Ukraine, because there's a lot riding on this, not just for Ukrainians, but for European security, and for the basic proposition that big countries don't get to swallow up smaller countries just because they think they can. And I'm glad to talk more about that later on. On the Middle East, it's important to remember where this year started in a horrific terrorist attack which slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, took another 250 hostage. It's an issue that's consumed a lot of my time and attention and our agency's time and attention over the course of the last year. I always try to remember that the issue in Gaza for Israelis, for Palestinians, is not an abstraction. It's about human beings. It's about the hostages living in hellish conditions in tunnels beneath Khan Yunis and other parts of Gaza. It's about their families, amongst the bravest people I've ever known. It's about mothers and fathers in Gaza, the Gazan civilians who are caught in the crossfire and suffering enormously. It's about the humanitarian catastrophe that they face. I also try to remember that, what's at stake in Gaza is shaped by political will. In the end, it's not just about brackets in texts or creative formulas when you're trying to negotiate a hostage and ceasefire deal. It's about leaders, who ultimately have to recognize that enough is enough, that perfect is rarely on the menu, especially in the Middle East, and then you've got to make some hard choices and some compromises in the interests of a longer-term strategic stability as well, and in the interests of those human beings that I mentioned. Now we face the very real danger of a further regional escalation of conflict. The challenge that that we see in Lebanon today, after 2 weeks in which Israel has had some very significant tactical successes. The risk of a further escalation between Iran and Israel, even though we don't assess, at least, that either of those two leaderships right now is looking for an all-out conflict, but there remains that risk. And so, it's really important, I think, as we try to navigate the very tense period ahead of us, to keep in mind that the bigger challenge, I think, is going to be to translate those tactical successes into an effective strategy that marries the use of force, which is really important, especially in dealing with despicable terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, but marrying it with good intelligence and ultimately smart diplomacy to try to produce a ceasefire to Israel's north, as well as what has been a very elusive ceasefire in Gaza after the success we had at the end of last year, which produced the release of 100 hostages. Because I think, this is the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry to wind on so long, but the last thing I'd say is that, it's important to remember when you look at, as I said, a vicious terrorist group like Hamas, is that, it has military capabilities which have been severely degraded by Israel over the course of the last year, but it's also a movement and an idea. And in my experience, the only way you kill an idea is with a better idea, with not only security for Israelis, but a sense of hope for Palestinians as well. And so keeping in view, as we look at the past year and look ahead at the next year, that question of the day after is really, really important, I think, if everything we've seen over the last year is eventually going to lead to at least the possibility of a more stable region, which, is a lot easier said than done in all the years that I've spent working in and on the Middle East.
And you can find our full interview with CIA Director Bill Burns on the Cipher Briefs YouTube channel. Moving on now to a different series of elections in a part of the world where Russian influence has taken a strong foothold. Recent elections in Moldova, Georgia, and Bulgaria have made clear that Russian influence remains strong in the region. In just a moment, Cipher Brief Chief International Correspondent Iya Mermishvili sits down with Daniel Fried, former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, to talk about the high-stakes battle there for democratic integrity. But first, this message from the Cipher Brief.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at thecipherbrief.com.
Dan, thank you very much for joining us today. Moldova, Georgia, and Bulgaria had very important elections in the just past couple of weeks. Is there a uniting factor of some kind? And why should Americans care about these elections?
America has had an interest in a free, undivided Europe without dictators controlling it. We fought 2 world wars in the Cold War for that purpose. We decided, Democrats and Republicans, that it was in our American national interest that Europe not fall under the boot of a foreign dictator. So that remains a pretty good objective, especially when we see a foreign dictator, Vladimir Putin, trying to reestablish an empire through sabotage, disinformation, and, if necessary for him, war. So these 3 elections were all very different, and the situation of the countries are different. But in all cases, what we see is a struggle with high stakes between those political forces, left and right, who want to integrate with Europe, who believe in democracy, and an alliance with the United States or friendship with Europe, and those who believe in nationalism and linking themselves with the Russian Empire and Putin's empire. So we're seeing variations of all of these. In Moldova, you have a pro-Western, pro-democracy president dealing with massive amounts of Russian disinformation and money, and the Moldovan people narrowly but did vote to add EU membership to the Moldovan constitution. So they voted for a pro-free world, pro-European constitution. That was important. In Georgia, you see an authoritarian pro-Russian party apparently trying to steal an election. I say apparently because the final analyses have not been made, but the evidence of serious regime distortion of the vote is pretty strong, mainly that the credible exit polls and the official results were vastly, vastly different. Mm-hmm. And that's hard to explain, except by the regime putting its thumb on the scales. And in Bulgaria, after they've had a number of elections, but you had more or less the pro-Western, pro-European forces do pretty well, and the pro-Russian party not doing as well as many had feared. So Bulgaria, which is in NATO and in the European Union, is still a target for Russia because of historic Bulgarian sympathies for Russia. But these sympathies do not translate into desire to join Putin's attempted empire. Yeah. So 3 different elections, 1 underlying theme, and it's now the American elections where we have many of the same issues at stake, but that's a different topic.
Moldova is smaller than Georgia. Both of them are very small. Politically, economically, seemed more vulnerable to the Russian disinformation campaign, and it did not work with a very small margin.
Well, disinformation and spreading around money.
Why do you think there is this difference between Moldova and Georgia?
Well, in Moldova, you have a pro-Western president and a reasonable pro-European government. In Georgia, you have a pro-Western president, but she does not have any executive authority, and you have a government which is increasingly authoritarian, doing things like threatening to outlaw the opposition. And they do seem to have infiltrated what should be independent government agencies, like the Central Election Commission. In both countries, take a step back, in both countries, you have many people just struggling economically. And the populist nationalist parties are able to capitalize on this frustration, especially in Moldova, in minority areas. And in Georgia, you have smaller towns and villages who just want a better life. And the ruling party, Georgian Dream, is able to appeal to these people. Georgian Dream does have an electorate. They didn't make that up, but they do appear to have manipulated the vote in various ways because they don't have the support to be able to form a government, at least not honestly. And in all of these cases, you have the Russians on the side of those political forces who are opposed to a European future for their countries, because frankly, a European future means less corruption. And they probably like the corruption. It enriches them. So this is a nasty business.
Where do you see Russia's role in this?
Russia will support any government, I think, any government attempts to maintain power. From the Kremlin point of view, the more isolated Georgia is from the West, the better for Russia. Much depends on the Georgian people themselves. It's a staple of Kremlin propaganda that the United States engineered the Rose Revolution in Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and that's just nonsense. We didn't engineer any such thing. We were taken by surprise by both pro-Western movements. And it was the Georgian people and the Ukrainian people who simply were tired of authoritarianism and incompetence and demanded something better. Now, what the Georgian people will do in this situation, I can't say. Russia will be fine with any harsh measures that the Georgian government imposes on its people to maintain power, because the Kremlin wants Georgia to be isolated and weak and dependent on the Kremlin. And what Georgian Dream wants is something I can't say. But their actions are actually weakening Georgia, because the more isolated Georgia is, the more Georgia is dependent upon Russia, which makes no secret that it wants its empire back, and Georgia as a part of that empire. Georgians have a long history, over a century, of what I would call liberal Western politics. I don't mean left or right. I mean, in the 19th century, Georgia was a country where there was a certain liberal spirit that showed itself during the First Georgian Republic from 1918 until Stalin crushed it. And so Georgian civil society is not something created by Washington. Okay, it's native to Georgia. It has a long tradition. Georgians are proud of this. I've heard them talk about this at length. And whether Russia can crush this using the tools of the Georgian Dream government, or whether what tactics Georgian Dream uses to crush us, I can't say. But this depends on the Georgian people, and then the United States and Europe need to speak clearly now and find ways to support the Georgian people in what may be a prolonged and difficult period ahead.
Do you think that Georgia is on the verge of having a revolution?
It's not for me to say. And the last thing Georgians need are Americans, outsiders, giving them advice. Support is good. Advice is something I wouldn't dream of. Georgians need to make up their minds what to do. And Georgians are smart, okay? And President Jurabishvili is a deeply experienced, strong, and capable person. I've known her for many, many years. And she's not a partisan person by nature. She was trying to be a president for all the Georgians. And like many Georgians, she had just had enough of the Georgian dream authoritarianism. But what Georgians do now is something I can't say. But the United States, and I think Europe also, need to respect the Georgian people and invest in the Georgian people, because the Georgian people are smart, okay, and determined to find a European future for themselves.
Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, and I wish the circumstances were better.
And this note on Moldova's election: the country re-elected its pro-European President Maia Sandu over the weekend, despite a massive hybrid operation by Russia aimed at subverting that election. Back in a moment, but first, this word from the Cipher Brief.
The cost of armed conflict is high. In the modern world, to weaken the most powerful democracies, authoritarian regimes rely on more sneaky sabotage. It's guerrilla warfare, not on the field, but online. Their ammunition is disinformation, designed to sow division and dysfunction. They prey on emotions, enticing people to share links with half-truths or lies, promoting the most extreme voices that further the divide, targeting us with ads and bots that mislead, and weaponizing sensitive information to sow chaos and distrust. It's so subtle, most people don't even realize it's happening. Their disinformation campaigns target democracies with 3 overarching goals. First, divide the people. They stoke anger and inflame existing divisions to get people to turn on each other. It becomes an us versus them mentality, painting the political opposition as the enemy. In an effort to keep audiences watching and advertising dollars flowing, news sources and social media can inadvertently fan the flames of the divide, allowing disinformation to spread like wildfire. Second, discourage compromise. By depicting political opponents as the enemy, the democratic process becomes increasingly polarized. Politicians are elected to fight, not compromise as democracy requires. The government becomes gridlocked and ineffective. Third, destroy institutional trust. With democracy gridlocked, the next step is to convince the people that their voice doesn't matter, that institutions are working against them, and elections are rigged. Believing the system is broken, people disengage as frustration and anger grow. As an alternative, some even resort to violence. With democracies weakened, authoritarian regimes fill the void, increasing their power, wealth, and control on the global stage. All without firing a shot. But democracies are built to adapt and can take steps to counter this threat. First, we must take this threat to democracy seriously. Second, we must address the structures that make democracies easy to exploit. And third, we must look for ways to reform our institutions to rebuild public trust. By taking action and working together, we can leave a healthy democratic legacy for generations to come.
Welcome back. A number of Cipher Brief experts weighed in this week on their views of what they see as the greatest global challenges facing the next president. I encourage you to check out what they have to say at thecipherbrief.com. And as you know, Cipher Brief experts bring deep expertise from government, from the White House, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and help you really understand the context through which they're seeing the evolution of these events. So once again, you can check it out on thecipherbrief.com. That's it for this episode of The World Deciphered, brought to you by The Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. Remember, you can find the full interviews with all of our experts on the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel, and I hope while you're there, you will hit the subscribe button. I also encourage you to stay on top of what's happening in the world at thecipherbrief.com via our open source report that's published Monday through Friday. A lot of people tell us it rivals the President's Daily Brief in terms of its focus on global events. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on The World Deciphered.